The night started like any other. It was a quiet evening, the kind that felt like nothing could go wrong. But for John, everything changed in the blink of an eye. His wife, Sarah, walked through the front door of their home, heels clicking against the wooden floor, her perfume lingering in the air. She seemed carefree, a little tipsy, humming some song from the office party she'd just come from. The kind of song that people hum when they've had one too many drinks, when the night feels full of possibilities. He smiled, expecting the usual routine. The brief greeting, the quick rundown of the party she'd attended, the jokes, the warmth. The kind of evening that had filled their 20-year marriage with comfort and understanding. But tonight was different. Tonight, Sarah barely glanced at him. She walked past him, not even offering a smile. She tossed her purse on the counter like it was a regular night, like there was nothing unusual about her behavior. For a moment, John stood still, watching her retreat toward the bedroom, the shower running soon after. He was no stranger to the office parties. They'd become a regular part of their lives, an accepted routine. Sarah had always reassured him, "It's just networking, John. It's just for fun." And he'd always believed her. After all, they were a strong couple, weren't they? He trusted her. He had no reason not to. But this time, this one moment, shattered that trust in a way nothing could have prepared him for. As Sarah's phone slipped from her purse onto the counter, it was the kind of moment he'd never paid attention to before. But tonight, for some reason, something compelled him to glance at it. And in that single moment, the screen lit up. A message. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait for the next party." Winking face. John's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked, hoping to shake the sense of dread creeping up his spine. Maybe he'd misread it. He picked up the phone. It wasn't just a harmless text. It was a thread of messages, pictures, and inside jokes between Sarah and some. "I'll think about it," mocking him. He had no idea. John's world crashed around him in that moment. He had been blind. His trust, built over decades, had been shattered in an instant. His wife, the woman he'd shared everything with, the woman he thought was his best friend, had been betraying him. And she didn't even have the decency to hide it. The sound of the shower turned on in the next room, as if nothing had changed. As if everything was still fine. But for John, nothing was fine. His heart was racing, his hands shaking. He didn't know if he was more heartbroken or furious. He didn't know if he could ever look at Sarah the same way again. But one thing was for sure. Tonight, everything changed. And he wasn't sure he could ever go back. John sat there for what felt like an eternity, the phone still in his hands. He stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what he had just discovered. The words on the screen blurred in front of him, but the truth behind them was undeniable. He had always trusted Sarah, his wife, his partner, his best friend. They had been through so much together, built a life together. How could this happen? How could she do this to him? The night air felt heavier now. The familiar hum of their home, the laughter they once shared, now felt distant, hollow. The sound of Sarah's shower running in the background was almost suffocating. A stark reminder that she had no idea what was about to unfold. John could hear the water hitting the tiles, hear her humming to herself, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the kitchen. He had to confront her. He knew that, but part of him wasn't ready. Part of him wanted to keep pretending, to hide from the ugly truth he'd just uncovered. But the truth had its way of creeping in, regardless of how much he wished it would go away. There was no escaping it now. The betrayal was too real. The trust was too broken. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, wrapped in her robe, her hair damp and loose, she didn't look at him right away. She didn't seem to notice the tension in the room, the way the air had shifted. She smiled, a half-smile, the kind she always gave after a long night out, as if everything were normal. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "I'm starving. You got anything for dinner?" John barely heard her words. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't thinking about dinner. All he could think about was the phone in his hands. He couldn't look at her without seeing the woman who had betrayed him, the woman whose actions had ripped apart everything they had built. Sarah, he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of raw emotion that he couldn't hide. We need to talk. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing, a hint of confusion crossing her face. What's going on? She asked, a little defensive, like she wasn't sure if this was a conversation about something trivial or something deeper. John didn't respond right away. He stood up slowly, the phone still gripped tightly in his hand. He turned it around and placed it on the counter in front of her, the messages on full display. The room seemed to fall silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. Sarah's eyes flickered from the phone to his face, her expression shifting from confusion to realization. What's this? She asked, her voice faltering now. John met her gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no screaming or yelling. He was too stunned, too hurt, to react with anything other than disbelief. Don't play dumb, Sarah, he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. How long? How long have you been sneaking around with Jake? Her face drained of color, and for a moment, she said nothing. She opened her mouth, as if she were searching for the right words, but they didn't come. The silence between them was suffocating. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, she said at last, her voice shaky. She took a step toward him, her hand reaching out like she was trying to soothe him, to calm him. But John wasn't in the mood for comfort. He wasn't interested in excuses or half-hearted apologies. I don't know what to say, she continued, her voice faltering. It just happened. It was just supposed to be one night, one slip-up. But it turned into more, and I didn't know how to stop. I never meant to hurt you, John. John shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You never meant to hurt me? How could you think that? You've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking around behind my back. And now you want to sit here and tell me you didn't mean to hurt me. Sarah's face fell, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. She looked down at the ground, as if she couldn't bear to look at him. I know I messed up, she whispered.
I'm sorry.
I was lonely, John. You were so busy with work. And I don't know. I didn't mean for it to turn into this. John's heart sank. It wasn't the first time she'd used the excuse of being lonely to justify her actions. She had told him countless times that she was struggling, that she needed more from him. But he had always been there for her. He had always tried to give her everything. And now, to hear her say this, it felt like another slap in the face. No, Sarah, he said firmly. This isn't about loneliness. This is about betrayal. This is about you choosing someone else over me. You chose him over me. And now, you want to tell me it was a mistake. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she wiped them away quickly, her hands trembling. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear, I didn't. But I couldn't stop myself. I don't know what happened. I got caught up in it. John felt his chest tighten, the hurt turning into something colder. Anger wasn't even the right word for it. He didn't feel rage. He felt hollow, empty. She had taken something that was so sacred to him and torn it apart. And now she was sitting here, asking for forgiveness. How long, Sarah? He asked again, his voice more urgent now. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, the truth hanging in the air like a thick fog. A few months, she said quietly, barely able to meet his gaze. It started as just flirting, but then it became more. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear. It was never about you not being enough. You were bored. John finished for her, his voice bitter. You needed excitement. You needed someone to make you feel desired again. Didn't you? Sarah nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, John. I know I've ruined everything. But I love you. I do. I got lost. John could feel the weight of the words she was saying, but he couldn't make himself believe them anymore. He had trusted her. He had given her everything. And now, she was sitting there, crying about how she had lost her way. I'm done, Sarah, he said, his voice low, steady. I can't do this anymore. For a moment, Sarah's face twisted in confusion. What do you mean you're done? "I'm done with the lies," he said. "I'm done with the deceit. You made your choice, Sarah. And now I'm making mine." And with that, he turned and walked out of their home, his home. The house that they had built together. The house that was now just a reminder of everything that had been shattered. The days following John's confrontation with Sarah were a blur of emotions. The pain was suffocating, and yet, it wasn't the kind of pain that came with a sharp, sudden wound. No, this was something far deeper. Something slow, gnawing at him with every passing moment. He had left their house that night, the door closing behind him with the finality of a chapter closing. But the weight of it all, Sarah's betrayal, her lies, the years they had spent together, kept him tethered to that place in his mind. John spent the next few days in a haze. He moved between friends' houses, trying to distract himself, trying to figure out what came next. The world outside seemed to continue as usual, but inside, he felt like everything had collapsed. He had left Sarah, but the emotional tether remained, pulling him back to the pain, to the love he had once thought was unshakable. Sarah called. Of course, she did. At first, it was the usual apologies, pleas for understanding. She begged for him to come back, promised things would change, that she could fix it. But John was resolute. There was no going back from this. There was no fixing the broken pieces she had scattered so recklessly. He ignored her calls. He turned off his phone. But even in the silence, the gravity of the situation weighed on him. Then came the text. It was from an unknown number. "Hey, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but you deserve to know the full story. Sarah's been lying to you about more than just Jake." John froze. His heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to delete the message and forget about it. But curiosity gnawed at him. He'd already had his heart ripped out once. What more could it hurt? What else could be worse than what he already knew? He didn't want to engage, but something inside him told him he had to. With shaking hands, he typed, "Who is this?" A few seconds passed. Then the reply came. "Someone who works with them. I've seen everything. And you need to know the truth." John's pulse quickened. His stomach churned. What truth? What was left to know? He tried to push down the wave of dread rising in his chest. He couldn't do this again. He couldn't open himself up to more pain. But still, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. The unanswered questions, the doubts, the whispers of things not said, all of it crashed into him at once. "Tell me everything." The reply came quickly. "Jake isn't the only one she's been sneaking around with at the office parties. There's more. You were right about one thing. She's been using these work events as an excuse for months." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. Sarah had lied, yes, but now he was realizing that the affair wasn't just a singular mistake. This wasn't some random moment of weakness, it was a pattern. A lifestyle. The message continued. "She's been with different guys, not always the same one. But there's always someone. It was never just Jake. You were just the guy who didn't ask enough questions." John sat there, numb, reading the text over and over. Each word twisted the knife deeper. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was about the deception that ran so deep. The affair wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a deliberate choice, repeated over time, each betrayal stacking on top of the last. How many times had Sarah chosen someone else over him? How many times had she lied to his face, claiming it was nothing, when it was everything? The message went on. "I overheard her once, laughing about how he has no idea, when someone asked about you. She was so sure you'd never find out." That one sentence, "He has no idea," echoed in his mind, each word reverberating through him like a bomb going off. He had been the fool. He had been the one who had been kept in the dark. The one who had trusted and loved a woman who thought so little of him that she'd laugh about how she could deceive him. The worst part? He had been so sure of their bond, so confident in the life they'd built together, that he never even considered the possibility that she could betray him like this. He had been too trusting, too willing to believe in the version of Sarah that existed in his mind. And now that version was gone, replaced with someone he didn't recognize. John didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the phone in his hand. The truth was more devastating than he could have imagined. But he couldn't ignore it any longer. He couldn't continue pretending like everything was fine. His world had been shattered, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. He had been the last to know, the last to understand the truth of what had been going on behind his back. But Sarah? She thought she could get away with it. She thought he would never find out. He needed to see her again. He needed to confront her one last time, to get the answers he didn't want, to hear her try to justify what she had done. It wasn't about closure anymore. It was about reclaiming some part of his dignity. He had given her everything. He had been a good husband. And now, it was time to show her that he wasn't going to be her fool any longer. That night, John drove back to their house. It was late, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the driveway. The familiar house loomed before him, a reminder of everything he had once loved. But as he stood at the door, holding the keys that were once his ticket to their shared life, he realized something. No matter what happened next, he could never go back to being the man he was before. When Sarah opened the door, her face lit up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw the look in John's eyes. For a moment, she didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. But John didn't need words. He didn't need her explanations. He didn't need her apologies. What he needed was the truth. He threw his phone onto the coffee table, and she saw the text messages from Lisa, the woman who had exposed everything. The lies, the affairs, the pattern of deception that had taken place right under his nose. "Read it," he said quietly, his voice calm but cold. Sarah's hand shook as she picked up the phone, her face paling as she scrolled through the messages. John watched her, seeing her world crumble, piece by piece. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It wasn't just about her affair with Jake. It was about everything she had done to him over the past few months. Everything she had stolen from him while pretending nothing had changed. She glanced up at him, her eyes wide with shock, trying to find a way to explain herself, but the words didn't come. There was no explanation that could undo what had been done. "How long?" John asked again, his voice eerily calm. Sarah hesitated, her lips trembling. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Finally, she whispered, "A little over a year." John exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of the admission settle in. He had known, in the pit of his stomach, that it had been going on for longer than he had suspected. But to hear it from her, a little over a year, made everything feel like a cruel joke. A year of his life wasted. A year of his love, thrown away for something fleeting, something that had no value. She reached for him then, tears in her eyes. "Please," she begged. "We can fix this. I love you. I never stopped loving you. Please, just give me another chance." John shook his head, taking a step back. "No, Sarah. You broke this, and now you get to live with the consequences." The finality of his words hit her harder than anything else could. There was no going back. There was no fixing this. Sarah had already made her choice, and now it was his turn to make his. As he turned and walked away, he felt a sense of relief. No more lies, no more uncertainty. He was free, and no matter what Sarah did next, no matter how much she begged, it didn't matter anymore. He had reclaimed his life. And Sarah? Well, the consequences of her actions had only just begun. John left the house that night, the door closing behind him with the soft click of finality. He had walked away from everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and trust. The house, once a sanctuary of shared memories, now felt cold and hollow. It had been the place where he had built his life, but it was no longer his home. No matter how much he tried to cling to the past, no matter how many times he replayed the moments in his mind, he knew the truth. Sarah had made her choice, and now it was time for him to make his. As John drove away from the house, the streets felt strangely empty. He wasn't sure where he was going. He didn't need to. The freedom of not having to explain himself, of not having to make excuses for someone else's mistakes, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He could go anywhere. He could be anyone. In that moment, John wasn't just walking away from Sarah. He was walking toward himself, toward a future he never thought possible. He didn't cry that night. There were no tears, no emotional outbursts. The pain was still there, of course, but it wasn't the same. It had shifted, transformed into something different, something quieter, something that gave him a sense of clarity. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't bitter. He was just done. Done with the lies. Done with the betrayal. Done with the version of himself that had allowed someone else to dictate his worth. The days that followed weren't easy. There were moments of doubt. Moments when the loneliness crept in like a cold shadow. But they were also moments of growth. John started doing things for himself again. He signed up for the gym, something he had put off for years. He reconnected with old friends, laughed with them in a way that felt unfamiliar but comforting. He began to rediscover who he was outside of the roles he had played for so long: husband, friend, provider. For the first time in a long time, John started to feel alive again. Not because he had moved on from Sarah's betrayal, but because he had learned to live for himself. He had taken his power back, and with it came peace. But even as John embraced his newfound freedom, there was a lingering question. The thought that haunted him, that he couldn't shake, was whether Sarah would ever truly understand the gravity of what she had done. Would she ever regret the choices she made? Would she ever truly face the consequences of her actions? He didn't know. And in the end, he realized it didn't matter. It wasn't his burden to bear anymore. Sarah had her own path to walk, her own lessons to learn. And John, he had his own. As he sat on the edge of his bed that night, looking out the window at the quiet street below, John finally came to terms with something he had been avoiding. The story of his marriage, the love he had shared with Sarah, was over. But that didn't mean the story of his life was finished. It was just beginning. The future was uncertain, yes. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, and perhaps even more heartache. But John was no longer afraid. He had faced his greatest fear, that he was not enough, and come out the other side stronger. Now it was time to build something new, something that was entirely his, something that no one could take away from him. As the night wore on, John finally closed his eyes, the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt ready to meet it head-on. The road ahead was his to choose, and that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.